Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
Those comments from Donald Trump about 3 a.m. UK time mark the beginning of a new chapter in the Middle East. Whether it's a more dangerous one or perhaps a route to stability at some point in the future, on Sunday morning, we just don't know.
It's electrified the news, and as you say, we must discuss it with our expert witnesses in Sunday's newscast.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
It's Paddy in the studio.
And I'm pleased to say we're joined for today's podcast by Gary O'Donoghue, the BBC's North America correspondent. Hello, Gary.
Hello. Hello, Laura.
And by Gordon Corera, security analyst and host of the Rest is Classified podcast. And let's start with you, Gordon, and then the same question to you, Gary. Surprise in the night?
I think not surprised that the Americans eventually went in. I think that was always likely. The direction of travel was there. I think surprised it was maybe now rather than a few more days' time. Whether that was precipitated by something we don't know, or whether it was simply there was a bit of misdirection with Trump saying, I'm going to wait, there's 2 weeks for me to decide. Hard to know which it is, but the fact that they've gone in, I think it would have been hard for the US to feel like Israel had started the job and it was left unfinished. That was always going to be problematic, I think, for them. And so you could always sense something might happen. But I think the scale of it, also a little bit of a surprise as well.
Gary, it's interesting, Gordon suggesting there, actually, this was always probably going to be the eventual outcome, but the timing was what was in question. Was that your sense in DC?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I got a text from my producer, my response was a 4-letter word beginning with S, because we'd thought that having heard this 2-week deadline on Thursday, that at least it would take a little bit longer than that. But there are a few options here. One is that it was a ruse. One is that those words from the Iranian foreign minister in Geneva, and then again later on, made them make up their minds pretty quickly. The other option, of course, is that Donald Trump, has been sort of baited a little bit about his 2-week deadlines, which he's had a few of, and they've come and gone. And you never know whether that may have played into this calculation as well.
So it's weakened the mountain where some of the nuclear plants are in Iran. It's weakened the regime. We'll discuss if it's polarised Donald Trump's base, which is a large part of it was don't get us involved in any wars. But let's go to you first, Gordon. You said the scale of this might be worth talking about. So just in bullet points, what has the US dropped, what ordnance and where?
Well, it's dropped a number of these massive ordnance penetrators, the bunker busters as they're known, which are designed to burrow down through concrete and hit sites. Now, it's interesting because they've not just hit Fordo, which was the site that everyone was expecting them to hit, which was in the mountain, but also Natanz and Isfahan, 2 other nuclear sites. So that already was a surprise. So more of those, if you like, than was expected, and also with multiple munitions because you're trying to use them to burrow down. And then they've also fired Tomahawk cruise missiles at sites as well. So it is a broader campaign, I think, than was expected. Because I think the idea, I'm sure, from the American military planners was if you're going to go in and try and do as much damage as you can. I think what we are waiting for is the kind of what they call the battle damage assessment. In other words, how much damage has this actually done? And that's crucial because it's not a question of how many munitions you drop and what they're called. What matters is what they do and were they effective or not. And Iran, of course, has said, minimal damage to some of these sites. And they would say that, wouldn't they? But we don't really know how effective they've been. And the Americans are, Donald Trump talked about the sites being obliterated. So you've got 2 very contrasting narratives there about how effective that is. And that matters because, we do not know whether these sites really are destroyed, how deeply protected they are. We also don't know, for instance, whether they moved some of the highly enriched uranium out of them to different places, which could also be protected. So the idea that it's all done, even with a bigger strike than we expected, I think it's certainly too soon to tell with that. And there might be quite a lot of dispute about the facts as well.
It's interesting, though, Gary, Donald Trump has already said if Iran doesn't make peace, they might do it again. He's suggested he's completely willing not for this to be one and done, but actually maybe 2, 3, 4 and go on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a confusing message there, isn't there? Because the messaging initially was very much one and done. And then, as you say, when he made his address, we got this, you've got to choose peace or tragedy. And we've got plenty more sites, and it's going to be a lot easier next time, he said. And at the same time, they're saying, no regime change, that's not what we're after. So there's a whole multiplicity of messages, and it's very difficult to know. And they certainly don't necessarily line up with Israeli war aims here either, do they? Because certainly those far-right parts of Benjamin Netanyahu's government have been much more explicit about decapitating the regime in Iran and replacing it. So that could all fall apart. But the assessment of the damage will be crucial, because you can't possibly know 50 minutes after the bombs have dropped that there's been complete and total obliteration. You just can't know.
And someone on the podcast has to say this is a regime with many malevolent actors in it, and directly accused of sponsoring terrorism in different parts of the world, of obviously fighting a proxy war with Israel, with Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. And so we put that out there. But you're imminent, Laura, but I was just going to say to Gary, just in a couple of sentences, the US argument, A, the Democrats, what are they saying? B, the MAGA people. I thought they didn't really vote for war, did they? I thought they said America first, thanks.
They voted very much not for war. And I think, Donald Trump would certainly not want to put boots on the ground in any situation. And I think he sees this as a step or a couple of steps before that. If you were bombing from tens of thousands of feet and sending cruise missiles from hundreds of miles away, it's a kind of television war. And I think that's what they'll be relying on. But it will all depend on the nature of Iranian retaliation. If that hits home and hits hard and starts touching softer targets as well as military targets, that kind of thing, then the power of American public opinion can turn what was a sort of fantastic military exercise into something much more difficult politically at home. And that is the risk for him, where this fracture already exists and could get wider.
So on that question of retaliation, we were lucky this morning. The Iranian ambassador to the UK came into the studio to speak to us. It was the first time that he has spoken to the BBC. And we all remember, newscasters, I know you know this, but we should say there's no free reporting in Iran. So it's very often very hard to work out exactly what's going on. And the regime does not like free reporting, and they do not always tell the truth. But when we had the ambassador on this morning, he was very clear that retaliation, he wouldn't say specifically what, was very much on the table, that Iran had many different options to look at. And he told us this morning that these attacks were a violation of Iran's sovereignty.
There is no doubt this attack is a violation of the United Nations Charter, and as well as armed aggression to the Iranian national sovereignty and Iranian territorial integrity.
Gordon, in terms of the options for Iran and how they may hit back, we often hear sort of blood-curdling language from them. But given they've been under attack from the Israelis for a couple of weeks, they've gone after and killed many of their military leaders, they've degraded many of their facilities. What are the potential options?
Well, it was interesting. I thought your very interesting interview with the ambassador this morning. He was very careful not to outline any options. He was very cautious about getting into specifics and saying they'll consider it, because it's a big call for the Iranians. You can outline a series of options. I mean, they could attack, for instance, American bases in Iraq and the Middle East. That is one option, which is, if you like, at the lower end of the possibilities. And it's interesting, if you go back to the assassination of Soleimani, who was the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's kind of overseas force a couple of years ago, at the end of the first Trump administration. That's how the Iranians responded. They fired some missiles, but they kind of signaled it. And it was a way of saying, we're doing something, but we're also going to kind of signal it in advance, and that's it. So that is, if you like, the lowest level of potential retaliation. Then you move up to closing the Straits of Hormuz, which has huge economic consequences for the world. You go through to proxy attacks using terrorist groups, undercover sleepers, others, to try and carry something out. And they've got relationships with different groups around the world. They could do something, in other words, covert or overt for signaling. They could do it quickly. They could wait. But I think one of the problems the Iranians have got is their capacity, because a lot of their missiles have been taken out by the Israelis, and the missile launchers have been taken out. How much have they kept in reserve that they haven't been firing into Israel? We don't really know that, and we might be soon to find out. And for them, the calculation is what do we need to do to try and signal partly to their own population that they're still in control, so that they don't weaken their grip on power, which is obviously their number one priority. But how do they do something without inviting further escalation from the US and drawing the US in a way which could lead ultimately also to regime change? So they've got some difficult calculations, and that leadership is under pressure. They've lost a lot of their military commanders from Israeli strikes. So they're going to be confused. And I think that decision-making process is going to be very, very difficult. And, it's quite hard to predict, actually, I think, how it will play out.
And just for clarity, we should say to people that, Gordon, please do correct us if this is not accurate. But America's military might compared to Iran's military might they're not on the same league remotely, are they?
They're not on the same league remotely, but also, remember the lesson of Iraq, which is, the Iraqi military was crushed by the US in 2003, crushed in a remarkably quick operation. And what happened next? The problem is it's what happens next. What is the strategy? And I think a lot of people worry with Israel, having started this conflict, what is the strategy? What is the end game? Where does it lead to?
Well, because, the thing is, newscasters are shouting at their earbuds because in 2003, Tony Blair bombed another country beginning with I over WMD, weapons of mass destruction, and it didn't go well. It polarized the United Kingdom. It split the left. It stopped very much resources being used in the same way for years. It was said it's affected what we do, and this brings us really to the division in the Western Alliance. Gary, the Europeans and Keir Starmer had been urging de-escalation, jaw, and then we wake up this morning and the Americans said it's war, love. Did you see the bomb that you didn't want dropped? We dropped several of them.
Yeah, and of course the real difference about Donald Trump is his whole America First approach. So, where in the past, George W. Bush, he wanted allies, didn't necessarily need them, but wanted allies in that war in Iraq. Donald Trump doesn't care about having allies when he's doing these things. He is going alone in that sense. The thing they always mention here in terms of what Iran can do is they have these phrases: the missiles, militias, and what they call terrorism. And as Gordon was saying, the missiles are depleted, the militias are depleted around as well. So the thing that's left is this kind of asymmetric warfare, attacking soft targets, kidnappings, all potential possible retaliations, which are the real things that could really get under the skin of American public opinion. Those personal stories, individuals attacked, killed, taken, anything like that. And that's the unpredictable thing here, that Iran is no match, but it knows where to press the buttons. And we've had the Iranian foreign minister today in his press conference saying not only is Iran, has America betrayed Iran, but you've deceived your voters, you criminal, is basically what he said. You've deceived your own voters. So trying already to press those domestic buttons that, even the most powerful man in the world is subject to that pressure.
And in that interconnected world we live in now, where so much politics is done online, instantly messages zipping all around the world, international leaders know each other's weak flanks and they know how to press it in this sort of traditional sense of a hugely powerful country and then a tiny minnow. That's, as you say, Gary, the fancy word is asymmetric. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean that the big one is always going to be win over the small one. I just wonder if it's worth talking about what might be the sort of, I suppose, best case scenario after this dramatic event and the worst case scenario. So when we spoke to the Israeli president this morning, Isaac Herzog, he, as you would expect, is spelling out what he believes would be a best case scenario where the Middle East becomes a safer place in the end, because Iran, which has backed groups that have wreaked terror in different places, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis also in Yemen, beyond that region, if they have their nuclear ambition removed, that, in his view, is a good thing that could bring a new era of stability. This is what he said.
We decided to leave it to the Americans and to the president if he wants to carry out the strike, because the strike was aimed on very specific installations where the Iranian nuclear program was very much advanced. and it was actually a clear and imminent threat to the free world. I didn't know about it specifically. I was woken up when it happened, but I can say that what's really is important here is the fact that it can open a new venue in the Middle East, because I think there's a potential for a different Middle East, as President Trump said in his statement.
So this takes us really to what the rule of law and the United Nations view of the world is, because you can bomb and say it's going to lead to peace, or you can negotiate and say it's going to lead to peace. That's a choice. Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "I'm gravely alarmed by the use of force by the United States against Iran. This is a dangerous escalation in a region already on the edge. It's a direct threat to international peace and security. There's a growing risk that this conflict could rapidly get out of control with catastrophic consequences for civilians, the region and the world. I call on member states to de-escalate and uphold their obligations under the UN Charter and other rules of international law." Gordon, why is it right for Washington to bomb Iran and wrong for Moscow to bomb Kyiv? What do we say to students of international politics? How are they different?
Well, I think we're in a situation, we're in a changed world where, unfortunately, the UN and some of the old rules feel less and less relevant. And I think that is one of the worries for people, is that we are in a world in which increasingly, might and force are right, or being used and exercised, rather than people abiding by systems of international law. Now, you could say 'twas ever thus, and you go back to Britain and America in 2000. Invading Iraq. Again, they didn't get that second UN resolution, which many in Britain felt would have been needed to authorize such an operation. So, there is an element in which this is the way big states have always operated, and we might not want it to operate that way, and we might not like it, but there is an element of which that is the world, and increasingly the world we're living in. I think, the issues of, the morality of different actions, you have to judge in their own terms, if you like. Who are the aggressors and on what grounds are they doing it? Is there any justification? Is there any sense of self-defense? Now, I think you can have very different views about Russia and Ukraine from the US and Iran, and you have to kind of get into the details of them, which I'm not sure we want to get into every detail of it to see the differences between them. But I think what your point, which is that there is not really an international law around this, is the correct one, and that's just the reality in which we're living, unfortunately.
It was interesting. A couple of days ago, I asked someone who was a very senior person around the time of Iraq, who went through all of that as part of the Labour administrations, about this question of international law. And if there were an attack, where would it be? And they said, well, the thing you have to remember is international law in the end is fungible, which is a very fancy way of saying you can almost interpret it any way you like. And the political decisions are actually always the ones which in the end take precedence, even though you can have huge big political rows about the legal advice and the legality. And I'm not for a second disputing its importance. But actually, the sort of brute force of politics is sort of always what it comes down to in the end. But I just want to go back, Gordon, to our trying to do the best case scenario and then the worst case scenario. So we heard from Antonio Guterres saying, look, this might be a sort of deadly spiral. It could pull a much wider conflict. But for newscasters, what might that look like? I don't want to depress people too much over their coffee and toast on a Sunday morning, but just can you sketch it out for us so we understand what could be at stake here?
Well, I mean, there are lots of, the worst case scenario, I suppose you'd say, is actually a long-term ongoing conflict in which Israel and the US are sucked into a war with Iran because of Iran retaliatory cycles, but one in which it doesn't end simply, in which there is no decision by the Iranians or by anyone else to kind of move to a political negotiation. There are then worst case scenarios within that, I'm afraid, particularly, for instance, that Iran maybe gets to secrete some nuclear material somewhere, which isn't destroyed, races for a bomb, and either tries to test it, use it, and that other countries then race for a bomb. There are worst case scenarios in terms of the collapse of the Iranian state, which as we've seen in other countries, be careful what you wish for when it comes to regime change, because you don't know what comes after. I mean, that's not necessarily it. Some people think, well, it'd be great to get rid of the Ayatollahs, maybe, but it does depend on what comes after. So there's very complicated quite difficult scenarios out there at the extreme of the bad side, I think there is a best case scenario in which maybe the Iranians move to a deal because they feel we haven't got many other options, or there's a quick retaliation, a quick response, and then a lid is placed on this, and it goes relatively quiet. There's quite a range of scenarios though, and I think anyone who tells you they know what's going to happen, I'm not sure.
Don't believe them.
No, but we're lucky to have you and Gary as people who can brief us without just speculating. And I'll say again, because newscasters will want it said, this is a regime that the world did not want to have a nuclear bomb. It's been merrily beating up women for wearing the wrong things, hanging gay men and repressing human rights, turning off the internet. And history will say that this was an action that happened in the name of preventing the proliferation that Gordon was talking about. So that's out there, and that will be the sort of argument that the White House is going to have to make on the talk shows as America wakes up. Gary will see the White House come out and say it's it's struck for freedom. Here we are. We didn't want to do it, but the history will show that we've slain this regime's ambitions that have always been calling us the infidel, death to America. So who's coming out, and what will they say?
Well, they're sending out the big guns today, as you would expect. Many of those who were flanking Donald Trump in the East Room last night will be on those talk shows making exactly that argument. They'll be pressed, of course, on what happened to the commitment about forever wars, which is a huge problem for them, because as Gordon was saying, no one knows where this goes. They can't be sure that this stops here, much as they'd like it to. And they will hope that that whatever the retaliation is, that it's kind of absorbable, that it's absorbable in its nature, that it's short term, that it's something. I mean, when they hit those bases after Soleimani was killed, some of those soldiers got these what the Pentagon called at the time TBIs, traumatic brain injuries. And what you saw Donald Trump do after that was kind of minimise those injuries. He talked about them as headaches, as a way of kind of trying to manage what had happened as a part of the consequences of that. So we may see some of that go on, that Americans minimising the nature of the response and the consequences of it. But, and this is the big but, if, and I don't want to depress people either, if you start seeing body bags appearing at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, that is the nightmare scenario for the administration here. These are all very, extraordinary possibilities, and who knows whether they're practical or not, but these are sort of things that you have to think through as possibilities that could be something that tips this right over the brink.
It was very interesting this morning. Jonathan Reynolds was speaking for the British government, the business secretary. It was very obvious how much he actually thought this has been a welcome development. I don't mean the bald fact of America bombing another country. I mean the idea that a power has tried to destroy, with what appears to be some success, but we don't know specifically yet, has tried to destroy and attack Iran's nuclear facilities. And I was very struck by that, hearing a Labour politician essentially say, we didn't like the way it happened, but we're happy with the outcome. And I think the government is also very keen here to say to Brits and people listening to this and people who are watching this morning or listening to you on the radio this morning, Iran is a country that seeks to do harm to the UK. There's lots of evidence of plots being foiled, whether it's the Director General of the MI5 has been very public about it. The government was obviously this morning seeking to communicate that message very clearly. This is not a problem thousands of miles away. It's a problem right here in this country too. And I just wonder, Gary, is there any of that sort of communication in the US too?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it goes back to what Paddy was saying about, students of international relations. We are now in a world, because of the nature of this presidency, where realism, if you want to use the terms of international relations, where realism is the dominant philosophy. The idea that, we're living in a sort of norms-based order where, David Cameron can go to Libya or Tony Blair can talk about liberal interventionism and sort of spreading values, that's past. This is all about pure, naked national interests. And that is what, once America has adopted that, in a sense, everyone else has to as well, because, otherwise you're kind of shouting into the wind. And I think it's a language, of course, that the MAGA base understands, but also ordinary voters understand, putting the interests of your nation first in a time, and certainly in an uncertain time that we live in economically and militarily now. So that is the predominant philosophy that's driving this. And I think, it does chime with a lot of voters here.
So we close by thanking Gary O'Donoghue in Washington, D.C., where it's the middle of the night as we record this. Gary, thank you very much indeed. Washington is awake, we can say, and alive with the talk of this. Thank you very much, Gary. And also to Gordon, we say thank you, Gordon. Thank you to you for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.